Welcome to Share Speech.
What's going on, everyone? Today I'm going to be talking with Rabbi Zober. Right? Would you like to introduce yourself?
Certainly. I'm Rabbi Benjamin Zober. I am currently co-rabbi of Temple Sinai in Reno, Nevada.
Cool. So, introduction to Judaism, could we talk about basic tenements? What's basic ideas, if you could describe what Judaism is in a few sentences, what would it be?
Oh man, you picked the hardest question.
Right. Okay.
So, there are a number of ways to go about this. At the heart of it is a belief in one God.
Yes.
That's sort of what separates us in a lot of ways from other things, but it's not necessarily the most useful thing. So
Okay.
Instead, I'll tell a story that I think illuminates for me a lot of what it's about.
Perfect.
There were two schools of Jewish learning, and there's a guy who I think was mostly trying to cause trouble.
Okay.
And he goes to the one of the teachers, Shammai, and he says, "I'd like you to teach me everything standing on one foot." And
The teacher's on one foot?
yeah, well, that's the question. Is I think the idea is that the teacher stands on one foot.
Okay.
Right, but essentially saying, if you're so great a teacher, teach me all these things standing on one foot. So what would you imagine that this great teacher, right, one of the two top minds in this community, would do in the face of such an offer?
Probably say get lost.
Yeah, that's exactly what he did. He chases him out with a stick.
Okay.
So the guy goes across the street to Hillel, who's the other teacher, one of the great figures in Jewish history, and he takes the challenge a little differently. And now I don't know if he actually stood on one foot when he said this, but he says, "What is hateful to you, do not do to any person. All the rest is commentary. Go and learn it."
So whatever you would see as hateful done unto you, don't do the hate onto others, but then everything else is kind of middle ground to learn, and more it's like context specific, or that's...
Yeah, well, so and I think there's two things that we get from that. One is that that phrase may sound familiar, because it's similar in a lot of ways to the Golden Rule, right?
Yes.
Do unto others. But I think there's a specific kind of emphasis or mindset that comes about when you think about it, not from the approach of treat people the way you want to be treated, but thinking about how have you been hurt, or what has been problematic for you. And I think it engenders a certain amount of empathy, and that I think we can see in a lot of Jewish thought and in the Jewish experience playing on that. And then the second piece, right? The rest is commentary.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people that they sort of dismiss it and say, okay, I get the big idea, the rest is commentary, but go and learn it. And in Judaism, we never study text by itself.
Okay.
That when we open up the Hebrew Bible, when we open up the Torah, we're not supposed to just read it and go, okay, I got it, I know, I'm moving on, because it's not always so obvious. It seems obvious. Some of it seems really obvious when we read it.
Yeah.
But the reality is that this is an ancient text, and this is a text of a time and a place, and that is trying to communicate all sorts of things. So when we read texts, we do it with commentaries, and there are countless commentators, sages, rabbis, scholars, who over the centuries have added their wisdom to the learning. So it might just be you key in on a single word. There's a guy, Ibn Ezra, who was a grammar nerd, right? Which is exciting to very, very few of us, right? But that's his focus, and almost always everything he's saying is, this is what this word means, or this is what this phrase gets us to. And when we look at those things, there's sometimes when one word can make a huge amount of difference, and if we're not reading it the same way or correctly, we run the risk of going off in all sorts of awful directions. And so that commentary, that's in some ways is where the magic happens, where we take it from sometimes really confusing, really sparse words to a huge expression of the Jewish experience and our philosophy and theology and all of those ideas.
And there's so much to break down in there. I think first with the nuance of what the first part of it is, don't do anything that you wouldn't want done unto you. How that's kind of the nuance of the Golden Rule. Because a lot of the time we might want stuff done unto us that we necessarily shouldn't have done unto us. And I think the nuance with that is maybe there's a condition where if we were in their shoes, we would really want it, but it might not actually be the best thing. So I think it leaves in room for that nuance as well, of not just always doing what we would want us to have done unto us, but then expanding it more and leaving in more of the nuance. Am I getting?
Yeah,
okay.
that makes sense. Yeah.
And the cool thing about the commentary, because a lot of people will say for the Bible example, or even just the Torah, the Tanakh. It's thought of as, this is the book, it was written a long time ago, this is the word, it can't change, verbatim, this is it. But what we're really discovering here is that's not the case. It's actually a continual dialogue, kind of pinning on notes and expanding on things, and a continual conversation to explore what was written and what it really meant. Right? It's not just taking everything at face value.
Yeah, so the conversation is the thing. I mean, so traditionally we believe that this is penned by God, written by God, and written down by Moses, and all of that. Yeah. And we can get into the whether we believe that it's a divine document or divinely inspired or a chronicle of a human story, depending on how you view history and all of that. But the reality is that this is our text. That this is in some ways, our family history. Yeah, it's a chronicle. It's a deeply political document that outlines an ideal of a way that a society should work.
And I think, sorry to interrupt, but I think that might be a perfect point to touch on. We think of all of these religious documents as rules, but when I read the first few chapters of the Bible, first few books by Moses, it wasn't a story, it was a recount of history in a way, right? And so that's, to me, I'm thinking, wow, that really is, it's not just rules to live by, but this is a whole family's tradition, and it kind of makes everyone part of this one family from... That's
the idea, right? Yeah. If we start, right, it starts with a single guy and it expands out, and we have a nation and all of that, and then now we have people all over the world who can lay claim to this as their tradition, and draw from that, and that the stories in it, whether it is actual history or family lore or allegory or any number of things, it's something that's meaningful to us, right? That I can think my great grandfather will tell stories about who he was and what he did. I never met him, obviously. It was a long time before I was around. But those stories are useful to me nonetheless. And in this case, I know that they're true, including the one about the horse thieves. But
horse thieves.
That's such is the story. But we can say the same thing in many ways for this book, right? I never met Abraham. I never met Moses. And if he existed, that's great. But if he didn't exist, the morals of those stories and the significance and what it has meant to have those stories as part of our tradition is still there.
Yes.
And so I think sometimes we get really bogged down in, did it happen, didn't it happen? And for some people, when they're confronted with historical evidence, it's jarring. Well, now what do I believe, and how do I do this, right? Or who will stand in contradiction and say, well, wait a minute, I know this is true, so I can't accept science. And as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said, that they answer different questions, that science does something different than religion. And there are times when we find they work together really beautifully, and we don't have to be afraid of science and religion not agreeing with one another, because they serve us in different ways.
Yeah. And that's a lot of the similar ideas I've gotten from talking with Christians, figuring out ways we can pick certain things from the religion, maybe moral compasses, guidelines on how we should behave, as ways we can unify, even if there's the disagreement about the literalness of everything in the book, the factualness of if the stories really happened or if they're just stories. But I think most people could get behind the ideas of the values in the stories, which, to me, that's why I'm doing these interviews. We can get these values out there, focus on them, and not just the really fun debates of is it real or not, and then all of these really big conflicts arise. It's just let's focus on what we've been able to gain from the stories, because they've obviously been very important. Otherwise, this book and this tradition wouldn't be here for tens of thousands of years. Right, passed down?
Depending how you do the math, but thousands of years for sure that we've had this. Yeah, I think good material tends to stick around, right? Doesn't explain why they're still making students read Great Expectations when they're in high school, but there's something about this, whether it's because some of it is so human, so relatable, right? There's dysfunctional families, there's rivalries, there's all sorts of human drama that we still see, and there's also values that get in it. And I think to me, I always tell people that religion is about drawing lines, right? That every religion has standards and ideas and says, we do this, we don't do this, putting these things together, and or no religion, right? Because there are many people without a religious background or without a religious faith that do a tremendous job of being moral and caring and decent people, and empathetic. They find ways to draw those lines, and that all religions draw the lines in little different places is something that, I mean, it's a reality. We can't deny that, and I think that initially it's important for us to recognize all the things that connect us, right? That treating people well and dignity, and there's a whole host of things that pretty much every religion you're going to find, even the ones that you disagree with, are going to say that.
Yes.
And I think if we start there and we recognize that and can see the divine in the other, or that we're all humans, or the things that we share,
the individuality in a way too.
Then we get to as you were sort of describing, the fun stuff, right? Because there are differences between our religions, right? We're not all the same thing, and just because we disagree on something doesn't mean that we have to be at odds with one another or fight one another. And in some cases, what makes us unique is what makes us special and interesting. And if we can find the ways to celebrate that, even when we disagree, right? That when we get into issues that are in the political realm, we're going to have, oftentimes a religion or a religious group is going to trend one way. And sometimes that puts them at odds with another group.
Or even in their group, because there might be someone in the religion who's kind of thinks differently how most of the religious thinks, and even then there's that. Yeah,
and if we can't celebrate the differences and respect that that's what makes us unique and wonderful and allows us to bring in different ideas and all of those sorts of things, even if we don't agree with that idea, we're never really going to get very far. And of course, if as far as we can get is, I see what we have in common and I'm going to love on that and go no further, that's better than thinking that those other people over there are weird and awful and should be massacred. So like always getting together, definitely a good thing, definitely something we want, but I think we can do more than that. I think we can go past that and get to a place where diversity is something that we truly value and celebrate and all benefit from. Yeah,
and this still gets back to having this diversity, yet still drawing these lines of, because let's think of illegal things. You still can't murder. That diversity is still not acceptable. Rape. So there's still some diversity that's not acceptable. But for the most part, this is what I talk about in my book, most religions are okay with, then you could think about Sharia law and then extremes of Islam and every culture that doesn't like gay people going that extreme. But for the most part, I think having the basic structures of don't kill, don't steal, don't rape, all of these things. Well, don't kill in self-defense, because that's a nuance, I think, of thou shalt not kill, right? It's not murder, but
so if we were to take a look at the text in the Hebrew, the word it's murder, right? Thou shalt not murder, which makes sense then, because you go, well, killing, right? That not all killing is murder, and there is a nuance there, and there's all sorts of discussions, and then what constitutes murder, and we can go on from. That's one of the things that marks Judaism is that while we start with the Tanakh, with the Torah and the prophets and the writings, there's what we know as rabbinic literature, which is the Mishnah and the Talmud, which essentially take that and pull it out, and we get into the discussions of what, in many cases, what does that all mean? Because if all the text says is thou shalt not murder, it doesn't give us a lot of context or a lot of guidance as to how we implement that, or how we react to that, or how we understand that. And so,
or even the consequences if someone
Yeah.
does it too. I mean, last time I was talking with you, you were introducing me to the book and a bunch of the specifics of the words that are used, how it's the interpretations that can really frame or kind of shift the language to mean one thing or another. So you asked me, what are the first few words in the first book of Moses?
Yeah.
All right, should we do this again?
Sure, if you want to go out there, yeah.
Yeah, so
Right, because I think this is one that most people know, right? We're talking Genesis 1:1.
Genesis 1:1. I have read it growing up Christian and Catholic. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth, or something like that.
Yeah, that's the standard, right? That's what you're going to get in most places.
Yes. So how is this different? How is this not?
Well, so the original Hebrew says Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, and and I love this because we're going to get tripped up on the first letter.
Literally,
right?
Yeah.
So Bereshit, it's the vowel under that first letter, the bet, is a shva. So it doesn't really it's b as opposed to b, right? If it was the sound is the. So if it was b, it would be in the, but it's b. So it's just in beginning, which is kind of nonsense. In beginning what, right? And which is what sort of gets us to this important idea that all translation is commentary. Right? That for some words, things translate really, really well, right? Like a stone is a stone.
Yeah.
Right, a rock is a rock. You can quantify that in a really easy way. But for a lot of words, especially within a language as old as biblical Hebrew, and because it has such a different worldview and understanding, a lot of the words and phrases don't have a literal translation. And as a result, when we translate that, when we try to put it into English, we have two options. We can go with literal, and we can make it very literal, and it will be wooden as all get out, and won't make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Or we can try to play with the words like poetry, and we might not be so literal, but we'll get to the idea of what's going on. And so we say with in the beginning is it's not right. That's that's not what it says. But then we have this unenviable task of going, well, how do we make in beginning I good? I don't really. So
it's not good English.
Right, because it's Hebrew.
Exactly. Yeah.
So there's and there are a number of different translations of the Bible. And in all sorts of different languages. And in many cases, when people set out to create translations, it was met with all sorts of fierce resistance, riots and death threats and things. It's serious business because this is, if we believe that this is the Word of God, and who are we to try and tell someone what that means? But because because we're not all fluent, none of us are fluent in biblical Hebrew, we need some way to mediate that. So this is the Jewish Publication Society. So their translation is when God began to create heaven and earth, which is still it works, it flows.
It gets to the idea of creation starting maybe our universe, or what we can recognize as our reality.
Right. I mean, it's sort of, and the reality is this is where our story picks up, right? When God begins to create heaven and earth. I think what's really lovely about this particular translation, and I don't know that this is the best one or the most accurate, but it's one, is that it allows for the idea that God is eternal. Because we believe that the idea that everything started on day one, including God, is not consistent with our theology.
Interesting.
But when you say in the beginning, well, it's like God suddenly appears, and first thing God says, I should make some planets and people and stuff. That's not really consistent with how we've seen it. So that's our right. That's one translation. But as I said, all translation is commentary. So when we translate things, we often have a bias, and I don't mean that in a bad way. We just have a perspective, and the way that we choose to translate things is often going to be influenced by what we're bringing in. And sometimes we, in reading things in translation, if we can go back to the source and kind of figure out where have people played with it, we can learn a lot about what people are trying to say or their experience. But it also means that we have to be careful whenever we're reading something in translation, because there is that risk, and many folks are not willing. They're not willing to admit defeat. So when they come to a word that they don't know, rather than say, "Hey, I don't know, and I'm not going to try to guess," they'll just sort of go for it whole hog, which can really be a problem because, as I said, one word can make a huge amount of difference. And if you're basing something on one possibly mistranslated word or misunderstood word, you can really make a mess of things.
And then there's that whole chain effect that goes down through that.
Yeah, some books are much better, and translations are better about kind of owning up to, hey, we're not sure here. Other ones just forge ahead and go, no, we got to define all the words. We're going to come up with something. But the reality is that some words just we don't have a translation. In some cases, we just don't know enough to even be able to say, because context gives us clues. But there's another word that it's in Hebrew, na, and it's some sort of, seems to be some sort of word of respect.
Okay.
And there are times when people say it to God, which you can understand. I'm going in front of someone, so I'm going to say some sort of honorific word. But there are other times when God is speaking to people and uses the same thing. And if you think that the same word of respect is used from person to deity and deity to person, there's something going on there. But we can't quite, at least in English, there's not because we don't really talk that way. So we don't have a word to say, oh, this is the same, functions in the same way.
Yeah.
And so some translations will just sort of skip it, some will put it in, but it's left to us to try and figure out what is going on here and what does this word mean kind of broadly rather than specifically, because we can't figure out the actual 100% meaning. So
one of the ideas I'm picking up from the translations, but also just the perception of each individual word, possibly, it's dependent upon the person, or at least their history for the most part. So I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, this makes sense why valuing others' perspectives and having this diversity in thought, maybe not just appearance, because that's not really a huge thing, but we want the diversity in thought, why that's so valuable and precious, because who is any one person to sit and say they know the absolute truth that God gave? I think that's probably one of the ultimate lessons of humility is, being confident given your thing, being honest how you would interpret the Tanakh, even just the world, but then having the humility to recognize, well, I could be wrong. I probably am on a lot, but it's still me even putting myself out there to be critiqued, to critique something, allows other people to see, and maybe they might find something good, maybe they show how it's horrible, and then some good comes from that. But eventually, the idea of having other people break down even something that's as traditional as, a book that's 3,000 years old, thousands of years old, we still see benefit from allowing new interpretations. So I guess this is one of the hallmarks of my book, never assuming we know everything. Right. I mean, even if you could recite the Torah perfectly and you're one of the people who write it, even those people probably don't have the absolute credibility to know the exact perfect translation in every detail. They might be able to recite it and write it, but there's still those nuances. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, well, and that brings us back to the commentary, right? All his commentary and the commentaries. That the commentators were scholars and well versed, and probably more versed than any of us could hope to be. And they offered their insights and opinions, and I think to them there was how much humility was there probably varied between the guys, but they were certain they were teaching this. In some cases, it was things that they had learned Other times it was things they figured out or conclusions they came to. And one of the beautiful things about the way that we do Bible study, is that they're in conversation with one another.
Yeah.
So you get someone in, the 1200s in France who offers an insight on something, and then 100 years later, someone in Spain is going to say, well, that guy got it completely wrong. This is the way to understand this. And then maybe 50 years later, in Egypt, someone's going to say, well, actually, the first guy was right, but for the wrong reasons, and the second guy was wrong for the right reasons. And we get to, and sometimes they're snarky with each other. They'll I mean, it's wonderful when they just kind of take shots at each other. Of course, half the time they do that, the other person is long dead, so they can't respond. But injecting a little personality into it, right? And that we talk about a chain of tradition, right? And that each one of these people adds another link to the chain, and we live in this amazing time that we have the benefit that we are literate at levels that were unimaginable in generations past, and that we have access to so many of the texts, and many of them in translation. So if we don't speak Hebrew or Aramaic or Arabic or Spanish or any of the languages that these things were originally written in, we have access to them, and we can engage with them. And then once we've assimilated all of that, then it gives us an opportunity to go, okay, what do I think? Because oftentimes in a lot of spaces where they study Bible, someone gets up and they read a passage, and either they say, this is what it means, I will provide you with no sources, no opportunity to ask questions or to critique, and we're moving on, right? This is what we believe, or this is what I believe, you should too.
Project.
Or in some where they're much more interactive. It means that someone will read it and then everyone shares their feelings as to what it means. And we absolutely should have opinions about this and should understanding, but knowing that the translations are only so useful, and knowing that there are generation upon generation of scholars and commentators who have studied this and have looked at all sorts of different sources and things and brought that together to help guide our understanding, to ignore all of that and to just jump to, this is what I think based on one quick reading, doesn't really do us that much of a service, and in fact can lead us wrong, because we are influenced by things that we've heard, or the values and mores of our society, and we tend to read things into the text that aren't necessarily there. And much of human history, or at least since these texts came about, can probably be traced to readings and misreadings of the text, and that that's not I think what they were hoping for with something that's ostensibly aimed at creating peace and a perfect society.
And I think one of the aims possibly with having all these interpretations and valuing the diverse perspectives is almost making it safeguards, so that if there's even one person who's able to do any kind of translation, any kind of interpretation, if one guy is able to, everyone has to be able to then. Right? So to me, it kind of makes me think of freedom of speech, and you have the right to, and even freedom of religion, you have the right to do what you want. And because you have this right for you to be able to vary and to have your own uniqueness, so does everyone else. But then, right, the lines that we draw as the culture to make sure you don't go too much. But I think we've been talking a decent amount about translations.
Yeah.
And I think what the first part, Genesis 1:1, was going to get into, the eternity of God. God could be God. I mean, this holds the door open for God existing before even our universe, or whatever the interpretation is for created. Created what? Right? What do we think about aliens? And what is there to say about aliens?
Honestly, that's outside of my scope of expertise. You'd probably have to talk to some scientists on what that is.
Okay.
I guess my usual go-to would be to say there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. If I can steal from Shakespeare on that one.
Okay.
Right. and I mean, one of the things, for good or for bad, with the texts that are so old and are in another language is that there are all sorts of things that emerge from them, and people will often and have often looked at various pieces and have seen different things, right? And said, oh, this is an allusion to one thing or another, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, things like mental illness.
Yeah.
I mean, when we get to King Saul had what seemed to be, at least from the descriptions, have some sort of mental illness. It doesn't say, because they didn't have the terms for or the understanding in the same way of it. But we can see that in there, right? And there's a lot, and then there are other things that are more either allegorical or more symbolic, and we draw from them. And we can of course go too far. We can always go too far, right? And we can because we can see anything we want if we look hard enough in there. Which is not fair to the text. And I think one of the things that in Judaism is that there are systems and kind of theories and philosophies that we're supposed to employ when we approach things, so that we are not reading it with complete just focus only on one thing and never expanding our understanding, but not reading, not so much that basically we take our agenda and try to find the excuse for it, right? It's the same. It's sort of the inverse of the early biblical archaeology. They said they would dig with a Bible in one hand and a shovel in the other, and they'd dig something up and they would go, oh, a pot, and they would flip through until Rebecca came out with a pitcher. This must be Rebecca's pitcher, which. I mean, I can't say it's not Rebecca's pitcher, but there's a methodological problem there, and so I think we can sort of do the same thing with our when we are digging through the text.
And I think that gets back to the idea of the language we had was limited. So when someone says there's a ring of fire and something coming down, we might see it now, and from our perspective of, hey, I want to see aliens in the Bible, it's so cool, that's my perspective is telling me, that's my bias, and I'd see these things and so, oh, yep, actually that's right there, that's not what is that, what could that be? That's a spaceship. But then that's just the perspective I have going into it, which is why I'm seeing it, because someone else would just think, oh no, that makes sense, that's something else, or even more, someone might take it more literal, no, this really is God coming down on top of the mountain or something. All right, so I think, the framework you have going into the interpretation, and is there anyone that really challenges, like you said, there's processes and basic axiomatic ideas for how to give the interpretations, how to do the commentary. Does anyone put commentary on that and try to argue around those, that maybe, there is only one right opinion, or there should, because there's that debate of literal versus any kind of...
Well, I mean, we debate about everything in Judaism, so
cool.
We have that. At some point, everyone has a limit, right? That everyone has the line that they draw or the place they go, and when we get into philosophies, kind of small p philosophies, right? Say literalism versus more symbolic, you're going to get some people with lines, right? Some people are going to say, no, this is all true. And we can't question that. And then you get people who say none of it's true. We should question everything, and do with it as they will. But most of the things that we encounter, that we discuss and we debate, because and I think that's one of the things that makes Judaism so strong and so effective, is that we can wrestle with things, right? That there's not, and you're going to go into spaces where they say this is what we believe, this is it. But most of Judaism, there are places where we ask questions and we debate and we do it not to be obnoxious. And sure, there are obnoxious people, right? Those are some of my favorite people, right?
Yeah.
But it gives me a chance to dazzle them and say, sure.
Yeah.
But we trust things more when we've had a chance to really to put them to some sort of a test, and that there's this notion of, it's called machloket shem shamayim, which is a disagreement for the sake of heaven, right? And where two people will come together and they'll have a disagreement about how to interpret or how to do something, and for them it is absolutely a crucial question, and these are like must be right. If I'm wrong about this, I've made this grievous mistake. But it's not acrimonious. It's not angry. It's passionate, and recognizing that the other person, although they may be completely wrong, has the same values in mind, and trying to get to the right answer for everyone's sake.
And I think that's pretty much what I try to highlight, or the message I want to emphasize in my book is, yeah, we're very passionate about what I believe, what you believe. You actually might be wrong. I might actually be wrong. We both might be wrong. And saying the critiques about each other. And I think I've been seeing this around lately. Dostoevsky said, a society will become so tolerant that the intellectuals will have to not speak so they don't offend the imbeciles. Where it's like, we need to challenge each other, but not for the sake of just being right, but for the sake of challenging. Is that the idea? Challenging so that we can all make sure we're pushing for this truth. Is that?
Yeah. There we're interested in coming to the right answer and figuring out what needed to be done or how to act, and the fact that they had different ideas as to that. It wasn't partisan. I think is probably the way that we see things now. That things are so that if I disagree with you, it's a reflection of you as a person.
And I hate you.
And this was not that. This was loving. That this was, as I said, for the sake of heaven. Right? This was like a holy argument. And
to me, that shows the way that tough conversation, the ability to debate peacefully, could have been motivated is by making that relationship as in the consequence of doing this is very important because this is for heaven. And so that's, I think, one of the best ways that religion, especially through this commentary, has been able to help followers be empathetic, take others' perspectives, and have social skills to critique and challenge and disagree, and not be convinced that this says something about the person, because we're all, I don't know if it's the idea in Judaism, we're all connected through God. God is in us,
right,
just as much as everyone.
We are all created b'tselem Elohim, in the divine image.
Yes, and so it's having that recognition, something, right, to say we disagree, but it's not about hating. And even if I'm wrong, it's not about me being right. It's about finding the truth, just in general. And there's only one way to do that. Go head ahead.
Right. Well, and one of the things that we see then in the Talmud, in these discussions of Jewish law, is that oftentimes it preserves all of the arguments. And so the losing argument is still in there, which, one, is a sign of respect to acknowledge, okay, you weren't right about this, but we still value your input as a scholar. But that over time we often change the way we understand things or see things. And there are times when someone's argument didn't carry the day, but sometime later they will revisit it and things will have changed, right? Or another idea will come up, something similar, and they'll say, you know what, it's not exactly like this, but that argument that it didn't make it here because of certain things, but that would be the right way to think about this particular problem, and that's one of the ways that these ancient laws stay relevant, right? Because there's nothing in this text about airplanes or the internet or light bulbs. So we instead have people who over the centuries have mediated that and have been able to make arguments and compare things and figure out how we navigate that. In similar ways that we have in the country with our laws, right? That there's nothing in the Constitution about an air force. But we have one.
Or Space Force.
Sure. Yeah. There's all sorts of things that didn't figure in, and one of the challenges, and it's one that's still ongoing, and perhaps more rancorous than we would hope, is how we reconcile a text of a certain time with the modern reality, right? Because for some people, we read it as it was then, for good and for bad, and other people say no, we need to recognize that it was of its time, and we're in a different time, and it can grow and it can change, and right. And then you have people in between, who take pieces of each, and we've not found the ideal way to do that, and we've not quite figured out exactly what we're supposed to do with it.
Yeah.
Maybe it's something we will eventually get to, and
that's kind of the whole. Basically, the majority of debate I see is in these, because each policy debate has its own ideas, but we're getting into the philosophies behind the sides of the debates, where, let's say Second Amendment, pro, against, it doesn't say anything about an AR-15. It doesn't need to. Like, we see these different sides. They both want, and this is, I think, very important with what we just talked about with the debate for heaven.
Yeah.
So, we all want this good country, and this is what I really try to do with my book, Why It's Behaving As Us. We all want this great country, unless you don't. Unless you don't. But we all want it. And we have these different philosophical ways that we think it should be attained, or even lenses we look through it at, but still being reminded that this lens isn't the absolute all correct 100% lens, and we do need to have value and see the other person's lens. And even if, just for the sake of actually being able to understand each other, if you want to win the debate, you got to know the other person's side. Right?
Well, and I think what you're suggesting brings us back to kind of the point from earlier, that about the shared values.
Yes.
Right? That we share the values, and I think that's important, particularly in a society, that we agree on things, right?
Yes.
How we go about it is a little different, and I always tell people when I'm giving a sermon, when I'm preaching, I'm an expert in Torah. I'm an expert in Jewish law, and what our morals are, and and that's where I can speak from. I can also speak about American law because I do have a degree in that, but that's generally not where I'm going. But right, but that I'm a teacher of Torah.
Yeah.
And I can get up there and I can say, this is what the Torah says, and how people live that out is up to them. And I hope that everyone takes the message from it and figures out how to do it. And that's true in all sorts of places, right? That we have things that we all believe as Americans, these the big broad values, hopefully that I mean, even if you don't want to believe those things, like you also have the right to. That's part of the brilliance of the country,
which is hopefully maybe even a nuance where people can agree on. Right.
But how do we get there, right? I mean, how do we? And you pick any number of the issues, and I think, say poverty. How do we deal with poverty? I think I would hope that we all agree that poverty is a problem.
Yes.
Something we don't want. And I would hope that when we try to solve that problem, that we come to it from a place of love for people and wanting to genuinely to make things better. But the specific way that we approach doing that is going to be different. And that's okay, because sometimes we're right and sometimes we're wrong, right? The economics, the social structures, the policies, philosophies, all sorts of things. At times we pick one and we're excited about it, and then sometime later we realize, what, that's not really sound. It doesn't work.
Yep.
And hopefully then we shift and find the better thing. But if we can't agree as to the values, then we can't get there. But I think we need to be able to recognize that if we are all serving the same values but have different ways of doing it, we can have a conversation.
Yes.
We can discuss that. We can work on that. We can come to a resolution as kind, moral, and just people. And ideally, if we do that, we'll come up with the right one or the best one, and everybody benefits.
Or even a better one, at least just better. And I think this is the fear I see when I watch political commentators and even the news is the sides of the country they have nothing in common, not even the basic tenets or philosophies the country was founded on. This side doesn't even want justice. This side doesn't even want this. And it's like, no, they still do. They just see it different.
Yeah.
And this is all why it's important to be reminded that we actually do share these ideas. Yeah. If we look at the preamble to the Constitution, the six goals, right? We the people, forget the branch part, what is it? We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, ensure domestic tranquility, all those different things. For the most part, justice, peace, all these things people agree on.
Yeah.
But it's just how it is applied. How, like you're saying, but if we're just remembered we both want it. Like, for example, George Floyd, the people who didn't think the cop was at fault and thought it was bad and was no justice, they still wanted justice, thinking that side is all just hateful. There might be some hate, but it's not all. And then on the flip side, thinking that the other side is, both sides want justice.
Yeah.
Both sides want freedom, prosperity. Even in the abortion debate, one could argue there's two different values involved. One might be life, liberty, pursuit of happiness for the baby, but then also pursuit of happiness, liberty on the mother's side.
Right. Well,
but then the baby.
We could. That's a whole other thing, and there's all sorts of
Yeah.
We're at time, so we definitely don't have time to delve into that.
Absolutely.
But you're right that's there's a lot of ways to look at it, and we lose sight of what the basic value is, and to miss the opportunity to say, what does that mean for you? How do we honor this? How do we hold this up? How do we come to an understanding? How do we come to something that serves all of our morals, if not our partisan ideals?
Yeah.
Because we're never going to all agree,
No.
and that we try to is just, I think that gets us into trouble.
Yeah, and real quick, wrapping up, note about my book. First part, we got to figure out where we cooperate, but then realizing we're always going to disagree. Disagreement's not going to go away unless there's some totalitarian, and then disagreement's just going to go in the shadows and then revolt. But I think this idea about commentary and all these different perspectives might get into the idea of ask a rabbi what happens when you die. Do I go to heaven? And then, well, do you? And then you start asking questions, and we get into the real perspective.
We don't really believe in heaven, so maybe?
Oh, shit. Wow. Well, we got to do this again. Well, I think this wrapped it up. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it.
It's been an honor.